Only believe, all things are possible.
Supernatural, the life of William Branham. This is the most phenomenal true story you will ever read. It will change the way you think about the world you live in and the world beyond. Chapter 1, Mysterious Birth Sign, covering the years 1909 to 1912. 15 is not too young to have a baby, muttered Ella Branham to herself, trying to bolster her courage. Why, I'm just as ready as... The pain struck again, stronger, more commanding than before. Ella felt her panic rise with a spreading discomfort. She held her swollen stomach and groaned. Not yet. Please, not yet. Not until Charles comes home. Beads of sweat popped out on her forehead. She staggered across the dirt floor to the cabin's only window, set in the middle of a crude wooden door. The window had no glass, only a wooden shutter which Ella left open during the day and closed at night. Now it was open. "Charles!" she screamed. Her voice seemed to evaporate into the Kentucky backwoods, with its vast expanse of hills and hollows stretching out from her in every direction. Knowing her nearest neighbor lived miles away made Ella feel desperately alone. The pain tightened around her stomach, driving her into a panic. "Charles!" she screamed. Again, "Charles, where are you?" Then her voice sank into a feeble sob. "Please come home. I need you." Charles Branham had received his logging pay that morning and had walked into Burkesville, Kentucky to buy a new pair of bib overalls. "In honor of my first child," he said. But what was keeping him so long? Had he gotten waylaid by a tavern? If so, it would not have been the first time in their one-year marriage. But surely Charles wouldn't do such a thing today. He knew their baby was due any time. The contraction subsided, leaving her spent. Ella sagged against the splintery door jamb, watching the sun settle behind the maples and oaks that had just begun to bud. It was April in the year 1909. Ella shivered as she closed the shutter. Now the only light in the cabin came from the sunset filtering through the chinks between the roughly squared logs. Pencil beams of light moved slowly across the table, a homemade affair, built from a sawed-off tree stump with wooden pegs for legs and a bench for a seat. The only other piece of furniture in the single 12-foot-long room was a primitive bed nailed to one wall. Ella staggered to the bed and collapsed on its straw tick, pulling the quilt up to her chin. The corn-shuck pillow crackled under her head with every move. As the room darkened to black, Ella thought about her former home in Paris, Texas, which she had so recently wanted to escape. Last year it had seemed intolerable, but now, from this position, it did not seem so bad. She had grown up in Texas as Ella Harvey. Her father was a hunter, trapper, and schoolteacher. Her mother was a full-blooded Cherokee Indian. Ella, the oldest of 4 children, had lived a wonderful, carefree childhood until 3 years ago when her mother died from scarlet fever. At that time, Ella was barely 12 years old, and her youngest brother was only 4. The chore of mothering fell heavily into Ella's lap. A little over a year ago, she'd met Charles Branham at a rodeo. Charles was short and handsome, with curly black hair, broad shoulders, and enough cowboy skills to defeat almost every bucking bronco that he challenged. Ella was smitten by his charm. Charles was 18 and she was 14, but she felt years older. At that time, marriage had seemed like a good way to avoid the drudgery of caring for her younger siblings. Now she wondered if she had merely jumped from one hot frying pan into another. Here she was, 15 years old, a stranger in the Kentucky hills, having a baby 40 miles from the nearest doctor, with not even a friend to call on for help. Burying her head in her pillow, Ella wept. Charles Branham returned to the cabin an hour after dark. He had been drinking, of course, but not enough to dull his thinking. He inched the door open quietly so that he wouldn't disturb his young wife if she were asleep. Then he heard her moan. Charles quickly lit a pine knot and set it on the lid of a fruit jar. The pine knot burned with a dim, sputtering light that gave off volumes of smoke. Because the cabin was naturally ventilated, the smoke drifted up past the rafters, sifting out through the cracks in the clapboard shingles overhead. "Charles," Ella whispered weakly, "tonight's the night. Go fetch your mama." Charles built a fire, then he hurried to his mother's cabin. The night was cold and clear, and the starlight made it easy to keep on the path. An hour later he returned with his mother and 2 neighbor women. Grandma Branham was a crusty old woman, tough as bacon rind, but seeing this little 15-year-old girl in labor softened her like hot coon grease softens boot leather. Not that Grandma Branham ever used boots herself. She'd never owned a pair of shoes in her life. Now she took charge of the situation. Having had 17 children of her own, she was well prepared to act as midwife for her new daughter-in-law. She insisted that Charles wait outside. He did not argue. Taking a blanket, he crawled under the lean-to tacked onto one end of the cabin, making his bed on the wood chips and bark. Pulling a flask of whiskey out of his pocket, Charles polished it off to calm his nerves. Before long, he fell sound asleep. As dawn approached, the commotion inside the cabin grew more intense. Charles roused. The eastern horizon was turning lighter with the approach of dawn, but the sun had not yet risen. He cursed himself for having dozed, and then started to worry because his baby had not yet been born. Was something wrong? Maybe he should go inside and check. Before he could make up his mind, he heard the high-pitched squall of a newborn. The cabin door flew open, and one of the neighbor women called, "Charles Branham, it's a boy." Sheepishly, Charles shuffled inside and closed the door. The room smelled of smoke from a greased candle on the table. Grandma Branham finished washing the infant, weighed him at 5 pounds, then gently laid him in his mother's arms. Charles stood near the bed with his hands tucked into the bib of his new overalls, nervously watching this wiggling, grunting little creature that was his son. Ella said, "Charles, he's got your blue eyes." Charles studied the small eyes, but in the dim light he couldn't tell their color. "We'll call his first name William," he said, "and his middle name will be Marrion." Ella tested the name with her tongue. William Marrion Branham. It sounded distinguished enough, and he can go by the name of Billy. "Charles, I think Billy's going to have your curly hair, too. Open the shutter so I can see him better." It was shortly after 5 o'clock, Tuesday morning, April 6, 1909. Daylight filtered in through the chinks, even though the sun had not yet topped the horizon. Charles opened the shutter, then drew back, startled. Something had darted through the open window. A light, like a star, about a foot in diameter. Ella screamed and cradled her son tightly to her bosom. The others, bewildered, stepped back against the wall. The strange light circled the room several times, then stopped over the bed, hovering above the new mother and the child, glowing yellowish green, pulsating with a life of its own. For less than a minute it held that position. Not long, yet long enough for everyone in the cabin to be sure they had really seen it. Then as quickly as it had come in, the fireball left, whirling up past the rafters and out through the roof. Charles stared up at the clapboard shingles with wide, unblinking eyes. Suddenly, a flurry of wings turned his attention towards the door, where a dove had landed on the sill of the open window. The snow-white dove eyed the room with curiosity, almost as if looking for something. When it spotted the newborn baby, it cocked its head and cooed before it flew away. Charles gazed after the bird for a moment, then rolled his eyes back up towards the roof. One of the neighbor women muttered, "Well, I never." The other mused, "I wonder what kind of young'un this boy will be." Billy Branham was only 15 minutes old. News spread quickly among the mountain folk about that young'un born yonder on the hill with a light over him. Some passed it off as sunlight reflecting from a mirror. Ella and Charles knew better, since there were no mirrors in their cabin. Besides, the sun had not yet come up. They were puzzled. Was there some spiritual meaning in the light? Charles wanted to forget it, but Ella wouldn't let him. She insisted that something must be done, and finally decided that their baby should be taken to a church and dedicated to God. At first Charles argued against this idea, but finally he consented, although the concession raked against the grain of his character. Now the question came up, where should they take him? The ancestry of Charles Branham was strictly Irish Catholic. On Ella's side, the Harveys were Irish Catholic too, except for Ella's mother, who belonged to the Cherokee Nation. However, both Charles and Ella had drifted completely away from their Catholic foundation, and neither of them had any formal religious convictions. They agreed that for their purpose, the best church was the nearest church. So, when Billy Branham was 2 weeks old, Charles and Ella bundled him up and took him down to the Opossum Kingdom Baptist Church, where a small congregation met each Sunday in a rustic log building with a dirt floor and pews made from boards lying across upturned blocks of wood. The Opossum Kingdom Baptist Church had no regular pastor. On most Sundays, the congregation sang songs and read from the Bible. But every 2 months, a circuit preacher came through and delivered a sermon.